You know, life has a way of handing us new challenges, of handing us new circumstances. There seems to be always a new circumstance, a new surprise, just around the corner. And when it comes, lots of times it catches us off guard. And we just want to say, I'm not sure I can handle this. I'm not sure I'm able to handle this. What am I going to do now? Well, that's exactly where Joshua was. Joshua had found himself in a new set of circumstances. He had been Moses' assistant for 40 years. He had been going through the wilderness with the Israelites, watching Moses take the lead, and then it happened. Moses died. Moses died, and God comes to Joshua, and God says, Joshua, it's your turn. It's your turn to lead these people into the promised land. So last week from Joshua 1, we found out that God comes to Joshua with a promise. God said, Joshua, you're going to have to lead these people, but here's my promise to you. Everywhere you go, everywhere the sole of your foot goes, that is, everywhere you go and you recognize my presence and my authority, I'll be with you. I will be with you, and I will give you the victory. Every place, every day, as long, Joshua, as you make sure you acknowledge my presence. Not only did God give Joshua a promise, he gave him a plan. He said, but Joshua, the book of the law, you are to start your day with it. You are to finish your day with it. You are to meditate on it day and night. In other words, have the Word of God as bookends to your life. You start the day with it. You end the day with it. And God says, Joshua, you're going to have challenges. And if you start the day, every day in my Word, then I will make sure I give you what's necessary to conquer the events of that day. Not only did God give Joshua a promise, not only did God give Joshua a plan, God gave Joshua power. God said, Joshua, wherever you go, you won't be alone. Wherever you go, I'll be with you. I will be with you. I will be standing beside you. I will be making sure you've got the victory. With that in mind, Joshua takes the children of Israel. And now flip to Joshua chapter 11. That's where we'll be this morning. Because Joshua 11, we see the results of Joshua going based on the promise of God, using the plan of God, and the power of God. And in Joshua 11, it really reads just like a laundry list of battles that Joshua was winning. So Joshua took all the land, it says, the hill country and the desert, and all the land of Goshen, and the lowland, and the hill country of Israel as its lowland. Joshua's taken all of it. Verse 17, it said that Joshua made a long war with all the kings. There was not a town that made peace with the Israelites except the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon, and all were taken in battle. For it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts so that they would come against Israel in battle in order that they might utterly be destroyed and might receive no mercy, but be exterminated just as the Lord had commanded Moses. And at that time Joshua came and wiped out the Anakim. Now, let's talk just a moment about these Anakim. Who are the Anakim? Well, remember when the spies were sent to spy out the land back in the book of Numbers? Remember, Moses wanted to see just how good the land was, so he chose the spies. And the spies went into the land, and they see these giants. And remember, they said, these folks are huge. These folks are giants. We're like grasshoppers when you compare us to them. These folks descended from those folks. Those are the Anakim. Now it says Joshua utterly destroyed them with all their towns. And look at the final verse though, verse 23. So Joshua, verse 22. So none of the Anakim were left in the land of the children of Israel. They remained only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had said to Moses. And Joshua gave it as an inheritance to Israel, according to their divisions by their tribes. Then the land rested from war. It seems like their mission was successful, doesn't it? Especially when you read that last sentence in verse 23, that the land rested from war, and we're led to believe here that they all lived happily ever after. But they didn't. Look again at verse 22. It begins with none of the Anakim were left. Now, is that so? Were none of the Anakim left? Were they all gone? Well, they were almost all gone. They were pretty close to being none of them left. The end of that verse, the end of verse 22 says, they remained only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. Now, for some reason, and I don't know why, for some reason, Joshua allowed these three cities to stand, even though they were occupied with the enemy. And I've been racking my brain trying to figure out why Joshua didn't go and destroy those three cities like God had told Moses and God had commanded him to do. And I can't figure it out. It wasn't that they were so big that they couldn't be conquered, because God had told Joshua, you remember my presence. You remember that I'm there and I'll be with you and I'll give you the land. So we know that wasn't the case. It wasn't that they were unconquerable. It wasn't that they were too hard. I wonder if Joshua thought, well, those three cities, they're tiny. They're tiny. They're of no consequence. Yes, they're filled with the enemy, but they can't do anything to us. I don't know. I don't know why Joshua didn't. But we do know that he didn't go conquer those three cities. The only reason I can find for it is Joshua was disobedient. Joshua was disobedient. And you know what? The same thing happens in our lives. We give our life to Jesus. We yield our will to His will. We surrender our lives to Jesus. We repent of our sin. We gladly leave them behind. We forsake all our old friendships, all our old habits, everything that keeps us back from surrender. And we say, God, none of the Anakim are left. And then we whisper under our breath, none of them are left. They only remain in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. In other words, we say, Lord, I'm all in. Well, I'm nearly in. Now here's the tragedy. These unconquered areas of our life become seeds of future sorrow and disaster. Now in Joshua's day, Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod were small. They were insignificant, though they were unconquered. That's right, why the land rested from war. These places were so small that they could never, ever, in Joshua's day, threaten Israel. But here's the problem. They began to grow. And they began to grow. And they began to grow. And there would become a day there would come a day where the name Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod would bring fear and suffering to the nation of Israel. Let me tell you what I'm trying to say. Consider the first city, Gaza. The first city that Joshua left unconquered. Now the word Gaza simply means the strong place. Now had Joshua conquered the city of Gaza, we would never ever have heard that name again. But we find that city mentioned in the book of Judges. We'll be using our Bibles quite a bit this morning, so turn to Judges chapter 14. In Judges chapter 14, chapter 15, and chapter 16, we have an account of a man named Samson. The word Gaza, as I said, means strong place. The word Samson means strong man. So in Judges 14, 15, and 16, we see what happens when the strong man goes to the strong place. Samson was a judge 20 years. Before he was born, God sent a vision to his mother, really an angel, and said, you are going to conceive and you're going to bear a son. And no razor will come upon his head, for the child will be a Nazarite to the Lord. And he will deliver the Israelites from the Philistines. So God told Samson's mother he was to be a Nazarite. According to Numbers, that meant three things. He never, ever was to cut his hair or to shave his hair. He was not to eat anything that came from the vine. No grapes, no raisins, no juice, no wine, nothing. And for no reason could he ever touch a corpse, under no circumstances. And one by one, this strong man became the weak man. And he violated his vows. And you know where he ended up? Gaza. Chapter 16 begins, verse 1. Once Samson went to Gaza, and he saw a prostitute there, and he went into her. When the Gazites were told Samson has come, they circled around and lay wait for him all the night at the city gate. In the beginning, he's a strong man. He meets this harlot. We know what her name was. Her name was Delilah. And little by little, he gives in. And little by little, he is seduced by her. Finally, she ends up cutting his hair. And verse 21 tells us, one of the saddest verses in all the Bible, that Samson did not know the Lord had departed from him. And so what happens is the Philistines took him out. They put out his eyes and they brought him down to Gaza. They bound him with bronze fetters and he became a grinder in the prison. Israel lost their leader. But worse than that, the name of the Lord was dragged through the dirt. Verse 23 of that chapter. In verse 24 it says, the lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. And they said, our God has delivered into our hands Samson, our enemy. And when people saw it, they praised their God. And they said, our God has delivered into our hands our enemy, the destroyer of our land, the one who multiplied our dead. Why did it happen? How did Samson wind up in such a horrible place? It happened because Joshua was disobedient. It happened because Joshua did not go to Gaza and did not conquer it. Joshua thought it was so small it could be managed. Joshua thought it was so small it would never give them trouble. Let me tell you, small stuff grows. And when God says to conquer it and you don't, pretty soon you're going to have trouble. And because Joshua did not obey, Gaza became the place of defeat. And none of them remained except in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Well, let's think about Gath for a second. Gath was a tiny place in Joshua's day. So insignificant that Joshua never thought they would cause Israel any trouble, so we might as well just not bother with them. But we're told in 1 Samuel 17. 1 Samuel 17, and you know the story. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. They gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah, and encamped the Socoh and the Euphrates. Verse 2, Saul and the Israelites gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and formed ranks against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side and Israel on the other side. And verse 4 says, 1 Samuel 17, and there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion whose name was Goliath. And Goliath was from Gath. Goliath was from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Goliath was defiant. And because Joshua allowed Gath to stand, Joshua several generations later stood in open defiance and challenged the people of God. Look at verse 8. Verse 8 it says that he stood and he shouted to the ranks of Israel, why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself, and let him come out to me. Joshua did not conquer the land of Gath, so here we have Goliath coming out, and he's basically brainwashing Saul and brainwashing the children of Israel, thinking that they cannot be beat. Now here's Saul, he's the king, he's the one who's supposed to go out there, he's the one that should stand up to Goliath, but because Goliath was so domineering and because Goliath was so defiant, Saul's scared to death. The tragedy is it never needed to happen. What a mess. And it could have been avoided. But because Joshua disobeyed and Joshua did not go to Gath, here we have Goliath. Gaza became the place of defeat. Gath became the place of defiance. And they remained only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. Now Ashdod was a very important place too. 1 Samuel chapter 4 tells us that the Israelites were attempting to overcome the Philistines at Ebenezer. The first attack wasn't too successful. They'd lost about 4,000 men. Well, there was a priest named Eli. He was the prophet, he was the seer, he was the priest, and his sons basically were taking over the priestly duties because Eli was old. They wore priestly garments, but 1 Samuel 2:12 says that the sons of Eli were corrupt and they did not know the Lord. They wore the priestly garments, they performed the priestly functions, but they did not know the Lord. And they made a mockery of the things of God. And because of that, due to their deeds, the very Ark of the Covenant was captured. In 1 Samuel 4:10 it says, so the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated. Every man fled to his tent. There was a great slaughter, and there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. And the ark of the Lord was captured. Chapter 5 of 1 Samuel says Then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. The place that Joshua could have and should have conquered had grown so powerful, they were able to capture the holiest of all, the ark of God. Verse 2 of chapter 5 tells us that when the Philistines took the ark of God, they brought it into the house of Dagon and set it by Dagon, the temple of Dagon, where the pagan god was worshipped. They brought the ark. And here at Ashdod, in that unholy place, the God of Israel was defiled and disgraced. Now Gaza produced a generation of pagan Philistines that stood against the people of God over and over. Gath produced a generation of godless giants that stood against the people of God over and over. And Ashdod brought the defilement of the holy things. And none of it needed ever to happen if Joshua had only done what God had told him to do. Now, what can we learn from Joshua's disobedience? We learn this. When we fail to deal with known sin in our lives, we are sowing seeds for future struggles. Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod were once small, were once insignificant, and because they were left alone, they grew to unnecessary future struggles. They grew to unnecessary sorrow. They grew to sin because Joshua disobeyed. None of the Anakim were left except in Gaza, Gath, and in Ashdod. Let me ask you, what unconquered areas in your life remain today? What are your Gazas, your Gaths, your Ashdods? You better identify them. You better uproot them. You better defeat them. You better turn your disobedience into obedience, and then you'll experience the victory of God. God has everything we need for victory. He's given us a promise. He's given us a plan. He's given us power. Let's identify those unconquered areas in our life. Let's experience victory over them. If we don't, if we leave them like Joshua did, one day we'll wish we'd have conquered them. One day we'll look back and we'll say, oh, but that disobedience cost me. Let us stand and affirm our faith.